Lena's eyelids fluttered open, her head throbbing with dull pain. The fluorescent lights above flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows across the hospital room. Something was wrong. The room was too quiet. Hospitals were never quiet. She pushed herself up, wincing at the stiffness in her muscles. Her last memory was of collapsing in the emergency room, a fever burning through her veins. Now, the Ford drip in her arm was dry, and the heart monitor beside her lay silent. A distant crash echoed through the hall, followed by a guttural groan. Lena's pulse quickened. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed, her bare feet meeting the cold tile. The hallway outside was dimly lit, papers scattered across the floor, blood smeared along the walls. Something was very, very wrong. As she stepped cautiously into the corridor, she spotted a figure slumped near the nurse's station. A security guard, his uniform stained crimson. "Sir?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. The guard twitched. His head jerked toward her. The moment their eyes met, her stomach twisted. His pupils were milky, his mouth twisted into a grotesque snarl. Then, he lunged. Lena barely had time to react before the man was scrambling toward her on unsteady limbs, fingers curled into claws. A deafening bang rang through the hall. The guard's head snapped back, blood spraying the wall behind him. He collapsed in a heap. Lena turned, her breath catching. A man in a hospital gown stood at the end of the hallway, holding a gun with trembling hands. His face was pale, his brown hair disheveled. "You okay?" His voice was rough, edged with exhaustion. Lena swallowed hard, nodding. "What's happening?" The man let out a bitter laugh. "Hell if I know. One second, I'm waking up from surgery, the next," he gestured to the corpse. "These things are everywhere." A door creaked open behind them. They both spun around as a woman emerged from a supply closet. She wore blue scrubs, her dark hair pulled back into a tight ponytail. Her face was streaked with sweat, and she gripped a pair of surgical scissors like a weapon. "You're alive?" she asked, relief washing over her features. "Not for long if we don't move," the man said, tucking the gun into the waistband of his pants. "Name's Chris. This is," he looked at Lena. "Lena." Dr. Evelyn Carter, the woman in scrubs supplied. "We need to get to the security office. It has surveillance feeds. We need to see how bad this is." Chris nodded. "And weapons. If that thing," he gestured to the dead guard, "isn't the only one, we're gonna need more than scissors and a half-empty pistol." Another groan echoed down the hallway. Lena felt her heart clench. More were coming. The three of them hurried through the hall, stepping over overturned gurneys and abandoned medical charts. Blood pooled at the entrance of a patient room. The door was ajar, and from within, a faint gurgling sound sent a shiver down Lena's spine. "Don't look," Evelyn whispered, pushing her forward. They reached the security office, the door slightly ajar. Chris peered inside before motioning them in. The room was small, cluttered with monitors displaying grainy footage of the hospital's halls. Most were empty. Others showed horrors that made Lena's stomach churn. Dozens of people, patients, doctors, nurses, stumbled through the corridors, their bodies twitching unnaturally. Some were slamming against doors, others gnawing at the flesh of the fallen. "They're everywhere," Evelyn breathed. Chris checked the gun's magazine and cursed under his breath. 4 bullets. That's it. Lena exhaled sharply. "So we're trapped." Chris looked at her, eyes dark. "Yeah. But not for long. We're getting out of here. One way or another." Outside, the lights flickered once more, and a distant, blood-curdling scream cut through the silence. The scream echoed through the hospital halls, sending a chill down Lena's spine. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to focus. Panicking wouldn't help. Chris was already moving, grabbing a chair and shoving it under the door handle of the security room. "This won't hold forever, but it'll slow them down." Evelyn paced toward the monitors, her fingers gripping the edge of the desk. "We need to figure out our next move." Her eyes scanned the screens, flitting from one horrifying image to the next. The main entrance is blocked by at least 50 of those things. Back exits? Chris asked, checking the gun's magazine again. He frowned. 4 bullets. Not nearly enough. Evelyn shook her head. The ER entrance collapsed during the initial chaos. And I don't like our chances running through the halls with no weapons. Lena swallowed hard. What about the upper floors? There has to be a way to the roof. Chris sighed. Sure, but then what? We just sit there and hope someone flies by with a rescue chopper? We don't have many choices, Evelyn pointed out. We need supplies, weapons, and a real plan. We can't just charge up there blindly. Lena leaned against the desk, trying to steady her breathing. Okay. What do we have? Evelyn rummaged through the drawers, pulling out a flashlight, a few keycards, and an old radio. This is a start. Chris exhaled. Great. A flashlight, some plastic cards, and a radio that probably doesn't even work. Evelyn narrowed her eyes. You got a better idea? Chris hesitated. His frustration was clear, but he held back whatever snarky remark had been on his tongue. Fine. What's the plan, Doc? Evelyn pointed to the monitors. The pharmacy is 2 floors up. If we can get there, we can stock up on supplies, find anything useful. Maybe even grab something to use as a weapon. Chris frowned. And how do we get there without becoming zombie chow? Evelyn held up a keycard. These open the stairwell doors. If we move quietly and avoid the main corridors, we might have a shot. Lena nodded. Better than staying here and waiting to die. Chris ran a hand down his face, then stood. All right. But we stick together. No hero stuff, no running off alone. A sudden, guttural growl from outside the door made them all freeze. Lena turned toward the monitor showing the hallway outside their room. A lone figure stumbled into view, a patient in a hospital gown, his arms covered in bite marks. His head twitched unnaturally, his eyes clouded with hunger. Then, he lunged at the door. The barricade rattled as the zombie threw itself against the wood. A wet, gurgling snarl vibrated through the air. The first impact didn't do much damage, but soon another figure appeared behind the first. Then another. Evelyn's breath hitched. They heard us. Chris grabbed his pistol and aimed at the door. We need to move. Now. Evelyn checked the keycard. There's a stairwell just around the corner. If we time it right, we can make a break for it before more show up. Chris nodded, glancing at Lena. You ready? She wasn't. Not even close. But she nodded anyway. Okay, Evelyn whispered. On 3, I open the door. We move fast and quiet. The pounding on the door grew louder. 1. A low, guttural growl came from the other side. 2. The chair under the handle started to give way. 3. Evelyn yanked the door open, and Chris fired a single shot. The nearest zombie's head snapped back, blood splattering across the floor. Go! Lena sprinted after Chris, her heart hammering against her ribs. Evelyn was right behind them, gripping the keycard like a lifeline. The hallway was worse than she expected. Blood smeared the floors, bodies lay crumpled against the walls. Some had been partially eaten. Others twitched. A figure lurched from a side room, its mouth hanging open in a soundless snarl. Chris didn't hesitate. He slammed his shoulder into the zombie, sending it sprawling. Keep moving. Evelyn reached the stairwell first, swiping the keycard. The lock beeped, and the door clicked open. In. Lena stumbled inside, breathing hard. Chris followed, then Evelyn, slamming the door shut just as another zombie lunged at them. The door rattled as the creatures slammed against it. Evelyn gasped for breath, pressing her forehead against the door. That was too close. Chris holstered his gun, sweat dripping down his forehead. No kidding. Lena wiped her palms on her hospital gown. Let's keep moving before we get trapped again. Evelyn nodded, gripping the railing as they ascended. They had survived the first hurdle. But the real nightmare was just beginning. The stairwell was eerily silent, except for their hurried footsteps and ragged breathing. Each creak of the steps felt like an alarm, warning whatever might be lurking above. Evelyn led the way, gripping the keycard as if it could ward off the horrors they had just escaped. Chris stayed close behind her, his gun raised, while Lena took up the rear, her nerves wound tight. We're heading for the pharmacy, Evelyn whispered. If we can grab medical supplies and anything remotely useful, we'll figure out our next move. Chris grunted. Yeah, and hopefully not run into more of those things. They reached the second-floor landing. Evelyn hesitated, glancing at the keycard in her hand before swiping it against the stairwell door's lock. Beep. Click. She exhaled in relief. We're in. Chris pushed the door open slowly, gun at the ready. The hallway beyond was dimly lit, the overhead fluorescents flickering weakly. A sickly stench hung in the air, a mix of blood, antiseptic, and something rotten. Lena swallowed back bile as they stepped out. Blood smeared the walls, dark stains trailed along the floor. A gurney was overturned in the middle of the hallway, and a body lay slumped against it. Chris motioned for them to stay close. They moved carefully, their footsteps muffled by the linoleum floor. A soft rustling noise echoed from around the corner. Evelyn stiffened. Chris gestured for them to stay put and crept forward. He peered around the bend, his posture stiffening. Lena leaned forward, whispering, "What do you see?" Chris turned back to them, his expression grim. A lot of bad news. Evelyn and Lena edged closer and peeked around the corner. The pharmacy was at the far end of the hallway, its metal security gate half lowered. The problem wasn't getting there, it was the 5 infected staggering aimlessly in front of it. Their hospital gowns were tattered, their bodies riddled with bite marks. One of them, a former doctor, had a chunk of his throat missing, the wound blackened and festering. Lena's stomach clenched. Can we sneak past them? Chris shook his head. No way. The moment we get close, they'll hear us. Evelyn exhaled, gripping her surgical scissors. Then what do we do? Chris checked his gun's magazine again. 4 bullets. Not enough for all of them. Lena scanned the hallway, her eyes landing on an old hospital wheelchair near the nurse's station. An idea formed in her mind. What if we make noise somewhere else, she suggested. Draw them away? Chris nodded. That could work. But we have to be fast. If too many come, we're screwed. Evelyn looked around, then pointed to a supply closet across the hall. There's a metal cart inside. If we shove it over, it might make enough noise to distract them. Chris smirked. Smart thinking, document. They moved quickly. Chris readied his gun while Lena and Evelyn edged toward the closet. Evelyn eased the door open, and Lena grabbed the metal cart inside. Chris gave her a nod. Do it. Lena shoved the cart with all her strength. It crashed against the opposite wall with a deafening clang. Instantly, the zombies turned. Their milky eyes locked onto the noise, their bodies twitching with new purpose. With guttural groans, they shuffled toward the source of the sound. Chris grinned. That did it. They hurried toward the pharmacy, Lena's pulse pounding in her ears. Chris reached the security gate first and tried to lift it. It groaned in protest, stuck halfway. Help me out, he whispered urgently. Evelyn and Lena grabbed the gate, straining to pull it up. The metal screeched loudly, echoing down the hall. The zombies stopped. Lena's stomach dropped as the creatures turned their heads toward them. Chris cursed. Hurry up. The gate finally gave way, sliding open enough for them to duck under. Chris and Evelyn scrambled inside, but as Lena followed, she felt a hand clamp around her ankle. She let out a strangled gasp. One of the zombies had caught up, its fingers digging into her skin. Its mouth stretched wide, teeth snapping. Lena! Evelyn lunged forward, stabbing her scissors into the creature's wrist. It howled, releasing its grip. Chris fired his gun, the shot blasting through its skull. Blood splattered across the pharmacy floor as the zombie crumpled. Inside. Now. Chris grabbed Lena and yanked her in. Evelyn slammed the security gate shut just as more zombies rushed toward them, clawing at the metal bars. Lena collapsed onto the floor, panting. That was way too close. Chris exhaled, wiping sweat from his brow. No kidding. Evelyn looked around at the shelves stocked. The relentless pounding on the metal security gate made Lena's skin crawl. The undead snarled and gnashed their teeth, their decayed fingers clawing through the bars in a desperate attempt to reach them. Chris took a deep breath, staring at the pharmacy shelves lined with medication, gauze, and medical tools. All right, he muttered. Let's grab what we can. No use sitting here waiting to die. Evelyn was already moving. She snatched bottles of painkillers, antibiotics, and alcohol, stuffing them into a plastic bag. We don't know how long we'll be stuck in here. If any of us gets injured, this could be the difference between life and death. Lena grabbed a scalpel from a nearby tray, gripping it tightly. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Chris paced near the gate, eyeing the undead. We can't stay here forever. Evelyn glanced at the shelves. There's an emergency exit in the staff wing, but it only unlocks from security. If we can get to the main office, we might be able to override it. Chris raised an eyebrow. You just happened to memorize the hospital's security system? I worked here for 5 years. Evelyn shot him a look. Yes, I know how it works. Lena's heart pounded. Okay. But how do we get out of here without becoming zombie food? Chris tapped his fingers against his gun, deep in thought. Maybe we can use the vents? Evelyn shook her head. The ventilation system is too small. We need another option. A crackling noise suddenly cut through the tension. Lena froze. Did you hear that? Chris turned sharply, scanning the room. The static sound crackled again, faint but unmistakable. Evelyn's eyes widened. The radio. She dropped the bag of supplies and rushed to the back of the pharmacy, where an old emergency radio sat on the counter. It was covered in dust, but the power light flickered. Evelyn grabbed it and twisted the dial, her hands shaking. A voice broke through the static. Hospital survivors, do you copy? If anyone is out there, respond immediately. Chris's head snapped toward the radio. Holy shit. Lena's breath caught. They weren't alone. Evelyn pressed the button. This is Dr. Evelyn Carter at Westwood Memorial Hospital. We have 3 survivors trapped inside. Who is this? A few seconds of silence passed. Then, the voice returned, stronger this time. This is Sergeant Mason of the 22nd Rescue Battalion. We've set up a safe zone on the outskirts of the city. If you can get to us, we'll get you out. Relief flooded Lena's chest. They had a chance. Chris leaned in. The hospital is overrun. We're trapped inside the pharmacy on the 2nd floor. Do you have any units nearby? Static. Then, negative. We lost communication with our forward team in your area. You're on your own until you reach the perimeter. Evelyn clenched her jaw. How the hell are we supposed to get out? The exits are blocked. Sergeant Mason's voice came back, firm. The underground maintenance tunnels run beneath the hospital. If you can get to the basement, you might be able to use them to escape. Lena exchanged glances with Chris and Evelyn. The basement. Chris exhaled sharply. Sounds like a death trap. It's your best shot, Mason said. But move fast. The city is being locked down. In a few hours, there won't be anywhere left to run. The line crackled, then cut out. Lena's hands trembled. The city is being locked down? What does that mean? Evelyn's expression darkened. It means they're going to bomb it. Silence filled the room. Chris ran a hand down his face. So now we have a time limit. Fantastic. A heavy thud made them all spin toward the gate. One of the zombies had thrown itself against the metal with a sickening crunch. Blood smeared the bars as it let out a ragged snarl. Chris turned back to the radio. Mason? Are you still there? No response. Lena swallowed hard. I guess we're really on our own. Evelyn set the radio down and picked up the bag of supplies. Then we'd better move. Chris checked his pistol. All right. We make for the basement. But first, we need a way out of this damn pharmacy. Lena stared at the undead beyond the gate. They weren't getting through that way. But she had an idea. The ceiling tiles, she whispered. Chris blinked. What? Lena pointed up. Most of these old buildings have removable ceiling panels. We might be able to crawl through and drop down somewhere else. Chris looked at her, then at the ceiling. A slow grin spread across his face. I like the way you think. Evelyn nodded. It's risky, but it might be our only shot. Lena took a deep breath. The basement was their way out, but first, they had to survive this floor. Chris cracked his knuckles. All right. Let's get climbing. Outside, the zombies continued to snarl, their rotten fingers reaching for fresh meat. They had no idea their prey was about to slip right through their grasp. Lena's heart pounded as she stared up at the ceiling tiles. It was a long shot, but it was their best bet. The alternative, facing the horde outside the security gate, wasn't an option. Chris holstered his gun and cracked his knuckles. All right, let's do this. Evelyn grabbed a rolling stool and positioned it beneath the weakest-looking ceiling panel. If we're lucky, the crawlspace above is big enough to hold us. Chris stepped onto the stool and reached up. He pushed against the tile, and it shifted easily. He lifted it out of place, revealing a dark void above. A musty draft blew down, carrying the scent of dust and mildew. Looks big enough. He jumped, grabbing onto the metal framework, and pulled himself up with a grunt. Yeah, there's some space. Not a lot, but we can fit. He peered back down. Who's next? Lena swallowed her fear and climbed onto the stool. Chris reached down, gripping her forearm as she stepped onto the pharmacy shelf for leverage. With a heave, he pulled her up. The air was thick with dust, making her eyes water. The space above the ceiling was tight, full of pipes and electrical wiring. Evelyn followed next, gritting her teeth as she hoisted herself up. The stool wobbled beneath her, but Chris caught her hand just in time. She scrambled into the crawlspace, breathing heavily. Below them, the undead continued to snarl and bang against the pharmacy gate. Chris secured the tile back in place. That should keep them guessing for a while. Lena wiped her sweaty palms on her pants. Which way? Evelyn pointed ahead. We need to move toward the stairwell. If we can find an opening, we drop down and make our way to the basement. Chris nodded and led the way, crawling carefully across the metal framework. Each movement sent a groan through the beams, making Lena wince. The last thing they needed was for the ceiling to collapse beneath them. The dim glow from emergency lights seeped through small gaps in the tiles below, casting eerie patterns in the crawlspace. They moved slowly, their breaths shallow. Every so often, a distant thump or groan would echo through the hospital, making Lena's blood run cold. After several tense minutes, Chris stopped. He pointed to a loose tile ahead, slightly ajar. Through the gap, they could see a dimly lit hallway below. Evelyn whispered, "That's the corridor leading to the stairwell." Chris carefully removed the tile and peered down. "Looks clear." He turned to Lena. "You're up." Lena's stomach twisted, but she nodded. She lowered herself through the gap, her arms trembling as she hung from the edge. Chris guided her down until her feet touched the floor. She quickly stepped aside as Evelyn followed, landing lightly beside her. Chris dropped down last, wincing as his boots hit the tile. "All right. Let's move." The hallway stretched ahead, eerily silent. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting long, jittery shadows against the walls. Evelyn pointed down the hall. The stairwell is just past those doors. They hurried forward, stepping over debris and bloodstains. Every doorway they passed made Lena's skin crawl. Any of them could be hiding something. As they reached the double doors, Evelyn tried the handle. Locked. Chris gritted his teeth. Seriously? Evelyn fished out her keycard, swiped it through the reader, and held her breath. Beep. Click. She exhaled in relief. We're in. Chris pushed the doors open, revealing the stairwell beyond. The metal steps spiraled downward into the dark. Lena peered over the railing. I don't like this. Evelyn pulled out her flashlight and flicked it on. We don't have a choice. Chris checked his gun. All right. Stay close, stay quiet. They descended carefully, the stairs creaking beneath their weight. Each step echoed ominously, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence below. The basement smelled damp and stale. The air was thick with decay. As they reached the landing, Evelyn swept the flashlight across the corridor. The walls were lined with exposed pipes, some of them dripping water onto the cracked concrete floor. A rusted metal door stood ahead, marked maintenance access in peeling letters. Chris tested the handle. It moved. He glanced back. Ready? Lena's stomach twisted, but she nodded. Chris pushed the door open. The basement loomed before them, dark and sprawling, lined with old storage units and machinery. And then, a low, shuffling noise echoed from the shadows. Lena's breath caught. Evelyn's flashlight trembled as she raised it. The beam swept across the room, revealing figures. Dozens of them. They stood motionless at first, backs hunched, their heads twitching slightly as if sensing something new. Then, as the light fell on them, their heads snapped toward the doorway. A chorus of guttural snarls filled the air. Chris slammed the door shut. Run! Lena turned and bolted, her pulse pounding in her ears. Evelyn was right behind her, flashlight bouncing wildly. Behind them, the door burst open with a metallic clang as the horde poured through. Chris fired a shot into the crowd. One of the zombies dropped, but the others surged forward, unfazed. The three of them sprinted down the hall, dodging debris. The maintenance tunnels had to be close. Evelyn gasped, pointing. There! At the end of the corridor, a heavy steel hatch stood open. Beyond it, a sloping tunnel disappeared into darkness. Lena's legs burned as she ran. They were almost there. Then, something grabbed her wrist. She let out a strangled scream. A decayed hand clutched her tightly, its fingernails digging into her skin. Chris spun and fired. The zombie's head snapped back, and it collapsed. Lena stumbled forward, gasping. Chris shoved her toward the tunnel. Go, go, go! They barreled through the hatch. Evelyn yanked it shut behind them and spun the locking wheel until it screeched to a halt. The undead slammed against the other side. Lena collapsed against the tunnel wall, panting. Chris wiped sweat from his brow. That was way too close. Evelyn's flashlight flickered as she turned, illuminating the narrow, damp tunnel ahead. We're not safe yet, she whispered. Chris nodded. Then let's keep moving. With the undead still pounding against the door behind them, they pressed deeper into the tunnels. There was no turning back now. The air in the tunnel was thick, damp, and smelled of mildew and decay. Every step Lena took sent a soft splash echoing off the narrow walls, the cold water soaking into her shoes. Behind them, the pounding against the steel hatch had slowed, but the muffled snarls continued. The zombies weren't giving up. Evelyn's flashlight flickered, casting shaky shadows against the tunnel walls. We need to move, she whispered. Chris wiped sweat from his brow and gripped his pistol tighter. Yeah, before those things figure out another way in. Lena swallowed hard and nodded. The tunnel stretched ahead, a seemingly endless corridor of darkness, with rusted pipes running along the ceiling and the occasional faded sign marking maintenance access points. They had no map, no idea how deep these tunnels went, and no guarantee they even led outside the hospital. But they had no other choice. The group pressed forward, their footsteps eerily loud against the wet concrete floor. The air felt colder here, and with every few steps, a distant drip, drip, drip echoed from somewhere in the darkness. Chris glanced over his shoulder. Anyone else getting the feeling we're not alone? Lena shuddered. Yeah. And I don't like it. Evelyn kept the flashlight trained ahead. These tunnels were used for maintenance and deliveries. There should be a way up to the street level somewhere. Chris exhaled. Let's just hope it's not swarming with the dead. They kept walking, their breaths shallow, their nerves frayed. The tunnel sloped downward slightly, and the water grew deeper around their ankles. Then, a noise. Not the slow, mindless groans of the zombies. A sharp scraping sound. Lena froze, her skin prickling. Did you hear that? Chris raised his pistol, scanning the tunnel walls. Yeah. Evelyn swung the flashlight toward the sound, the beam catching the glint of something metallic just ahead. A maintenance door. And it was open. The scraping sound came again. This time, it was followed by a low, guttural breath. Lena's stomach turned to ice. Chris took a step forward, gun raised. Who's there? Silence. Then, something lunged out of the darkness. A figure, emaciated and fast, burst from the open door with a blood-curdling screech. It wasn't like the sluggish zombies they had encountered before, this one moved. Lena barely had time to react before Chris fired. The gunshot echoed violently through the tunnel, deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet tore into the creature's chest, but it barely faltered. It slammed into Chris, sending him crashing against the wall. Chris! Lena screamed. Evelyn swung her flashlight at the creature's face, the beam revealing a gaunt, hollow-eyed thing that used to be human. Its mouth was torn open at the sides, its teeth jagged and red with fresh blood. It snarled. Chris grunted, struggling against its weight. He jammed his forearm against its throat, keeping its snapping jaws inches from his face. Lena didn't think, she reacted. She grabbed a rusted pipe from the ground and swung it with everything she had. The impact cracked against the creature's skull. It staggered, giving Chris just enough room to twist free. He fired again. This time, the bullet hit its mark. The creature's head snapped back, and it crumpled to the ground, motionless. Lena's breath came in ragged gasps. What the hell was that? Chris staggered up, his chest rising and falling rapidly. That wasn't a normal zombie. Evelyn knelt beside the body, her expression grim. It's evolving. Lena's heart pounded. Evolving? Evelyn nodded. The virus, if it mutates, it could create variants. Faster, stronger, smarter. Chris cursed under his breath. Great. That's just what we needed. A distant sound made them all freeze. More scraping. More snarls. Lena's throat went dry. There are more of them. Evelyn shot to her feet. We have to move. Now. Chris didn't argue. He grabbed his bag and bolted down the tunnel, Lena and Evelyn right behind him. The snarls grew louder. Then, a deafening clang echoed through the tunnel as another maintenance door slammed open. Lena risked a glance over her shoulder. Dark shapes, multiple, emerged from the open doorway, their bodies twitching and jerking with unnatural speed. Her blood turned to ice. Chris saw them too. Run! They sprinted through the tunnel, water splashing around their ankles. The creatures shrieked, their rapid footsteps closing in. The tunnel veered sharply to the left, and just ahead. A ladder. A rusted metal ladder leading up to a service hatch. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She grabbed the first rung and hauled herself up. Go! Go! Lena scrambled after her, her muscles burning. Chris turned, firing blindly into the dark. The snarls turned into high-pitched screeches of pain, but more kept coming. "Chris!" Lena screamed. He backed toward the ladder, firing his last shot before holstering his empty gun. Then he leaped for the rungs, climbing as fast as he could. Evelyn reached the top and pushed against the hatch. "It's jammed!" Chris cursed. "Move!" He shoved past her and slammed his shoulder into the hatch. It groaned, but didn't budge. Below them, the creatures were climbing. Lena's vision blurred with panic. Chris roared and rammed the hatch again. This time, it burst open. Cool night air rushed in. Chris scrambled up, pulling Lena and Evelyn out just as the first creature reached the top. Without hesitating, Chris slammed the hatch shut and twisted the locking mechanism. The snarls from below turned into screams of frustration. Lena collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for breath. They were outside. The city loomed before them, bathed in the eerie glow of distant fires. Evelyn wiped sweat from her face. "We made it." Chris shook his head. "No. This is just the beginning." Lena followed his gaze. In the distance, beyond the burning skyline, more figures moved. The city wasn't just infected. It was infested. Lena's lungs burned as she lay on the cracked asphalt, staring at the ruined skyline. Fires smoldered in the distance, casting an eerie orange glow across the darkened city. The streets below were filled with shadows, some moving, some standing still, all of them waiting. Evelyn wiped the sweat from her brow, trying to steady her breathing. "We're outside. That's the good news." Chris reloaded his pistol with trembling hands. "Bad news? We're stuck in the middle of a goddamn war zone." Lena swallowed hard. The city was unrecognizable. Abandoned cars clogged the roads, their windshields smeared with blood. The skeletal remains of buildings stood like tombstones, their windows shattered, their walls blackened by fire. And the undead were everywhere. Shambling figures lurched between the wreckage, their guttural moans echoing off the hollow streets. Some of them wandered aimlessly, but others stood still, as if listening. Chris's jaw tightened. "They're getting smarter." Evelyn turned toward him, her eyes dark with realization. "You saw it too, didn't you? In the tunnels." Lena shuddered. "Those things weren't just zombies. They were faster. Meaner." Chris nodded. "And now they're out here." The thought sent a chill down her spine. If those things, the evolved variants, had spread into the city, then nowhere was safe. Evelyn scanned the rooftops. "We need to find shelter. Preferably somewhere high, where we can see what's coming." Chris gestured toward a nearby building, a half-collapsed parking garage. "That might work. If we can get to the top floor, we'll have a good vantage point." Lena eyed the structure warily. "And if something's already inside?" Chris exhaled. "Then we deal with it." They climbed down from the maintenance platform, careful to keep low. The streets were littered with debris, burned-out vehicles, broken glass, and the occasional mangled corpse. Lena did her best not to look at the faces. As they approached the garage, a distant noise made her freeze. Thud. 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 Something heavy was moving. Evelyn raised her flashlight, but Chris grabbed her wrist. "No light." "Not yet." They pressed against the crumbling concrete wall of the garage entrance. Inside, the shadows stretched long, the deep recesses swallowed in blackness. Chris leaned in, whispering, "I go first. If anything moves, you run." Lena's heart pounded. "We're not leaving you." Chris gave a tired smirk. "Good. Then let's go." He stepped inside, gun raised. The garage was deathly silent. Rows of abandoned cars sat like forgotten relics, their doors hanging open, their headlights long dead. The air was thick with the scent of oil and rot. Evelyn moved beside Chris, gripping a rusted crowbar she had found in the tunnel. Lena followed, her hands slick with sweat. They crept through the lot, their footsteps light against the cracked pavement. Then, a shuffling sound. Lena spun, her breath catching in her throat. Between two cars, something twitched. Chris aimed his gun. "Show yourself." A weak whimper answered. "Not a zombie. A person." Lena hurried forward before Chris could stop her. "Hey, we're not here to hurt you." A man lay wedged between two overturned vehicles, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. He looked barely conscious, his skin pale from blood loss. Evelyn knelt beside him, checking his pulse. "He's alive. But he won't be for long if we don't move him." Chris glanced toward the entrance. "We can't stay out in the open." Lena hesitated. "Then we take him with us." Chris exhaled sharply, but nodded. "Fine. Help me lift him." They each grabbed an arm and pulled the man free. He groaned in pain but didn't resist. His clothes were torn, his face smeared with dirt and dried blood. Chris threw him over his shoulder. "Let's go. We need to get to the top floor before." A scream ripped through the night. "Not human. One of them." Lena's blood ran cold. Chris swore under his breath. "Move. Now." They sprinted for the stairwell, taking the steps two at a time. The sound of something crashing through the garage filled the air, metal scraping, glass shattering, heavy footsteps pounding against the pavement. The variants had found them. Lena gasped as she reached the top floor, her legs burning. Evelyn threw open the door, and they stumbled onto the open rooftop. The view was worse than Lena had imagined. The city was teeming with the dead. And now, so was the garage. Chris set the injured man down against a concrete barrier. "We're trapped." Evelyn spun, gripping her crowbar. "Then we fight." The stairwell door burst open. Two figures lunged through, one normal zombie, slow and sluggish, and one variant. The variant was different. It moved with terrifying speed, its hollow eyes locked onto them. It let out a high-pitched screech, its body twitching unnaturally. Chris fired. The normal zombie crumpled. The variant dodged. It moved like a predator, reading their movements. Lena barely had time to react before it lunged. Chris tackled her out of the way, the variant's claws slicing through the air where she had just been standing. Evelyn swung her crowbar, but the creature dodged again, twisting its body in an unnatural, jerking motion. Lena scrambled backward. They were outmatched. The variant hissed, preparing to strike. Then, a gunshot. The creature's head snapped back, blood sprang into the air. Lena spun. The injured man, still slumped against the wall, had his arm raised. A smoking pistol in his hand. Chris blinked. "Well, damn." The variant collapsed. The man coughed weakly, his voice hoarse. "Why you need to get out of the city." Evelyn knelt beside him. "We're trying. Do you know a way?" He nodded weakly. There's a quarantine checkpoint, just outside the city." Chris narrowed his eyes. "And it's still intact?" The man's breath rattled. "Last I heard, it was holding. But you have to go now." Lena looked over the edge of the rooftop. Below, more variants were gathering, their heads twitching, listening. Chris reloaded his gun. "Then we leave at first light." Evelyn nodded. "Because if that checkpoint falls..." Lena finished the thought for her. "Then we're all dead." A cold wind swept over the rooftop, carrying the scent of smoke and decay. The sky was beginning to lighten, but dawn brought no comfort, only the harsh reality that time was running out. Lena wrapped her arms around herself, staring down at the streets below. The undead swarmed in clusters, shambling between overturned cars and debris. The variants were different. They didn't wander. They watched. Their hollow eyes scanned the area, heads twitching, like predators waiting for prey to make a move. Evelyn crouched beside the injured man, checking his wound. His breathing was shallow, his skin clammy. "He's not going to last much longer," she whispered. Chris stood at the edge of the rooftop, reloading his pistol. "Then we don't have time to waste." The injured man stirred, his voice barely above a rasp. "You need to go, before they surround this place." Lena swallowed hard. "You said there's a quarantine checkpoint outside the city. Do you know how far?" The man nodded weakly. "Maybe 5 miles. If you stick to the side streets, avoid the main roads, you might make it before the sun's fully up." Chris sighed. 5 miles through that? He gestured toward the writhing masses of undead below. Not exactly a casual stroll. Evelyn stood. "We need transportation." Chris smirked. "Yeah, good luck finding a working car that isn't stripped or flipped." Lena frowned, scanning the street. Then she saw it, half a block away, hidden between the wreckage. A military transport truck. Her heart leapt. "There. That truck, if it still runs, we could make it." Chris followed her gaze, eyes narrowing. "It's risky." Evelyn grabbed her crowbar. "So is staying here." Lena took a deep breath. "We get to that truck, we have a chance. But we need a plan." Chris sighed. "All right. Let's make this count." The descent. Moving quietly, they descended the parking garage stairwell, avoiding the floors swarming with zombies. The lower levels had partially collapsed, forcing them to climb over debris to reach the ground. Chris peeked through the exit door. "All right. We make a run for it, stick to cover. No unnecessary noise. Got it?" Lena and Evelyn nodded. Chris took point, leading them into the street. The air was thick with smoke, the faint sound of groans and shuffling footsteps all around them. They weaved between abandoned cars, ducking behind wreckage when needed. The variants were still on the rooftops, scanning for movement. If they were spotted, it was over. Halfway there, a zombie lurched from behind a burned-out sedan, arms outstretched. Chris silenced it with a quick knife to the skull, catching its body before it hit the ground. They kept moving. The truck was closer now, but so were the undead. 2 normal zombies stood near the driver's side door, swaying mindlessly. A third, a variant, perched on top of the truck, head twitching unnaturally. Chris gritted his teeth. Figures. Lena's pulse pounded. "What do we do?" Evelyn gripped her crowbar. "We go in fast." Chris nodded. "On 3. 1, 2. Before he could say 3, the injured man coughed. A wet, ragged cough. Too loud. The variant snapped its head toward them. Then it screeched. The 2 normal zombies turned instantly, their dead eyes locking onto the group. Chris cursed. "Go!" The variant jumped from the truck, landing in a crouch like a predator. Its head twitched, its lips peeling back into a grotesque snarl. Chris fired. The bullet struck its shoulder, but the creature barely flinched. It charged. Lena barely had time to react before it was on them. Chris tackled the creature midair, slamming it into the pavement. The variant twisted like a rabid animal, clawing at him. Evelyn swung her crowbar, striking the creature's skull. It shrieked but didn't stop. Chris fired again, this time at point-blank range. The variant jerked, blood spraying from its forehead. It collapsed. No time to breathe. The other zombies were closing in. Lena sprinted to the truck, yanking the door open. The keys were still in the ignition. She turned them. The engine rumbled to life. Chris and Evelyn scrambled into the back as Lena threw the truck into gear. The injured man groaned as Evelyn pulled him into the cargo bed. Then, the roar of the engine drew the horde's attention. The undead charged. Lena slammed the gas pedal. The truck lurched forward, tires screeching against the pavement. Zombies lunged, some slamming against the sides of the vehicle. A few clung to the edges, their decayed fingers scraping at the windows. Chris climbed onto the roof, pistol in hand. "Shake him off." Lena swerved violently, throwing the clingers off balance. Evelyn stabbed a crowbar through the skull of one clinging to the side. Chris fired at another trying to climb onto the roof. The truck plowed through a cluster of zombies, sending bodies flying. Lena gritted her teeth. Which way to the checkpoint? The injured man coughed weakly. North, highway should still be open, if it's not overrun. Chris slid back inside the cabin. Let's hope it's still standing. Lena's hands tightened on the wheel. The undead were closing in behind them. The variants screamed, their high-pitched cries filling the air. Chris checked his ammo. This isn't over yet. Evelyn took a deep breath. No. But we're not dead yet either. Ahead, the ruined city stretched toward the horizon. And somewhere beyond it, their last hope. The military truck tore through the ruined streets, rattling over debris as Lena gripped the wheel with white-knuckled hands. The road ahead was a maze of wrecked cars, overturned buses, and collapsed buildings, but there was no turning back now. The horde was behind them, hundreds of the undead, surging like a tidal wave, their groans merging into a monstrous roar. The variants were among them, leaping across rooftops, moving faster than the shambling masses. Chris braced himself in the truck bed, rifle raised. We've got runners. Evelyn barely had time to reload her pistol before the first variant jumped. It landed on the truck's roof with a sickening thud, its claws scraping against the metal. Chris spun, fired, missed. The creature ducked, moving with unnatural speed. Then it lunged. Evelyn threw herself back as the variant crashed into the cargo bed, its jaws snapping inches from her face. She swung her crowbar, catching it in the ribs. It shrieked but didn't go down. Chris kicked it hard, sending it sprawling. Before it could recover, he fired, one shot, straight through the skull. The variant went limp. But there were more. 3 more figures leapt onto the truck, their twitching heads snapping toward the survivors. Damn it. Chris gritted his teeth and fired again. One fell instantly. Evelyn swung her crowbar at another, but the creature dodged with terrifying precision. It twisted unnaturally, then lunged. A gunshot rang out. The variant's head snapped back as blood sprayed across the truck bed. Lena risked a glance in the rearview mirror. The injured man was still slumped against the side of the truck, barely conscious, his pistol smoking in his hand. Chris exhaled. Remind me to buy that guy a drink if we live through this. Lena didn't answer. Because up ahead, the road was gone. The entire highway had collapsed, leaving nothing but a gaping chasm in its place. Evelyn saw it too. Lena! Brake! Lena slammed the brakes. The truck skidded, tires screeching, but it wasn't going to stop in time. Her heart pounded. She yanked the wheel hard to the right. The truck fishtailed, barely missing the edge as it slammed into a concrete barrier. For a moment, everything was still. Then Chris groaned. That could have gone worse. Evelyn pulled herself up, scanning the new obstacle. We can't turn back. The horde is right behind us. Lena swallowed hard, searching for an alternative route. That's when she saw it. A train yard, just past the wreckage. If they could get to the train tracks, they could follow them out of the city. Lena pointed. That way. If we can get through the yard, we can stay off the main roads. Chris eyed the twisted metal fencing surrounding the yard. Assuming we can get through. Lena didn't hesitate. We don't have a choice. She threw the truck into gear and tore toward the fence. The train yard. The truck crashed through the chain link fence, sending metal and sparks flying. Inside, the train yard was a wasteland. Rusted locomotives sat abandoned on the tracks, their windows shattered. Cargo containers were scattered haphazardly, some tipped over, spilling their contents into the dirt. And they weren't alone. Zombies staggered between the cars, their dead eyes turning at the sound of the truck. Lena didn't slow down. She plowed through a cluster of them, sending bodies flying. Chris held on tight. This better not be a dead end. Ahead, a half-intact locomotive sat on the rails, its engine eerily quiet. Evelyn pointed. There. If we can get that thing running. A screech tore through the air. Lena's stomach dropped. The variants were here. Chris's eyes widened as they spotted them, 4, 5, 6 of the creatures perched on the rooftops of abandoned train cars. Their heads twitched in unison, their blank eyes locked onto the survivors. Then, as one, they attacked. The first leapt onto the truck's hood. Lena screamed as its claws smashed through the windshield. Chris fired. The variant's head snapped back, blood spraying against the glass. It slid off the truck as Lena swerved wildly. But the others were coming. Evelyn grabbed the injured man and jumped out of the truck. "We need to move, now." Lena and Chris followed, sprinting toward the train. One of the variants tackled Lena mid-run. She hit the ground hard, gasping as its claws scraped against her jacket. Chris fired, but the creature dodged. It opened its mouth to bite. Then Evelyn's crowbar slammed into the side of its skull. The variant staggered. Lena didn't waste the chance. She grabbed Chris's knife and drove it into the creature's eye. It convulsed, then collapsed. Chris yanked Lena to her feet. "Come on." They reached the train. Evelyn wrenched the door open and dragged the injured man inside. Chris and Lena followed, slamming the door behind them. The variants screeched outside, slamming against the metal walls. Lena turned toward the controls. Please, please, please let this work." She pressed a switch. The train let out a low, shuddering groan. The engine roared to life. Outside, the variants screamed louder. Chris grabbed his rifle. "Hold them off while she gets this thing moving." Evelyn took position by the window, pistol raised. "Let's finish this." Lena gripped the throttle, heart racing. The train shuddered, then began to move. Chris fired at the variants clinging to the side. One fell. Another jumped onto the roof. Lena pushed the train harder. It rolled forward, faster. The undead tried to keep up. Some did. Then, the train burst through the far end of the yard, crashing through a barricade. The variants still clinging to it were ripped away by the impact. The train sped away from the city. Lena collapsed back, panting. Chris exhaled. "Holy shit, we made it." Evelyn looked ahead. "Not yet." Lena followed her gaze. In the distance, the quarantine checkpoint. It was still standing. For now. The train thundered down the tracks, racing toward the quarantine checkpoint. Through the cracked windshield, Lena could see the military barricades in the distance, improvised walls made of concrete slabs, sandbags, and rusted barbed wire. Floodlights flickered against the morning haze, and the faint outline of soldiers stood atop the perimeter. Her heart pounded. They had made it this far. They were so close. Chris leaned out of the train's side door, waving his arms. "We need them to let us through." Evelyn, still holding the injured man, yelled, "What if they don't?" Lena gritted her teeth. "Then we crash right through." Chris turned back toward the checkpoint, squinting. The soldiers had finally noticed them. There was movement, a few raised rifles, hurried chatter over radios. Then, the screech of the variants behind them. Lena glanced at the side mirrors. The horde was still chasing them. Hundreds of zombies flooded the landscape, moving in an unstoppable wave. The regular ones shambled and groaned, but the variants, they were running. Leaping between abandoned vehicles, sprinting across the open field, some climbing onto the moving train. Chris cursed. "They're not giving up." A thump on the roof. Then another. The variants had landed. Evelyn pressed her back against the wall, eyes darting to the ceiling. The metal groaned as the creatures moved, their claws scraping. The injured man stirred. "You need to jump." Lena's hands tightened on the throttle. "Not happening." Chris raised his rifle toward the roof. "We need to take them out before they stop this train." Then, a gunshot from the checkpoint. The soldiers were firing, but not at them. At the horde. The air erupted with the sound of machine gun fire. Bullets ripped through the zombies behind them, tearing apart the front ranks of the infected. Some fell, but the mass kept coming. A loud clang above. Then, a variant dropped into the train car. Chris barely had time to react before the creature lunged. It tackled him, snapping its razor-sharp teeth inches from his face. Evelyn swung her crowbar. It smashed into the creature's ribs, sending it stumbling. Chris shoved it backward and fired 3 shots to the chest. It fell, twitching. But not dead. Chris raised his gun again. Too late. The variant leapt onto him again. Then its head exploded. Chris gasped. He turned toward the checkpoint. One of the soldiers had fired the shot. The checkpoint was opening. Lena's chest tightened with hope. Then the radio in the train crackled to life. A gruff voice. "Get that train in here, now. We'll cover you." Lena didn't hesitate. She pushed the throttle forward, sending the train barreling toward the checkpoint. Chris grabbed the injured man and pulled him toward the doorway. "As soon as we're in, we bail." Evelyn reloaded her pistol. "Let's hope they don't shoot us on sight." The train screamed toward the entrance. Soldiers continued firing at the horde, grenades exploding in the distance. The variants, realizing they were losing their prey, went into a frenzy. One leapt from the tracks, claws reaching. Lena swerved the train slightly, crushing it against a signal post. Chris whooped. "Hell yeah!" Then, the train crossed into the quarantine zone. The checkpoint doors slammed shut behind them. Soldiers poured in from all sides, firing in disciplined bursts. The horde that had chased them so far crashed against the gates, their hands clawing at the steel. But they were too late. The survivors were inside. Inside the quarantine. The train slowed to a halt. Lena exhaled sharply, hands shaking. Evelyn let out a ragged breath, gripping the injured man's arm. Chris looked at the soldiers. Some had their weapons still trained on them, while others continued firing over the walls. A commanding officer stepped forward, his face hidden behind a dust-covered helmet. "You got lucky," he said. "We were about to give up on this city." Chris snorted. "Hell of a time for a rescue." The officer's eyes fell on the injured man. "We'll get him to a medic." Evelyn hesitated before handing him over. "Is the infection still spreading?" The officer didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced toward the city behind them, where the dead still pounded on the gates. "We're holding for now," he said. "But it's only a matter of time." Lena swallowed. "What happens next?" The officer met her gaze. "We get you out of here." Chris exhaled. "And after that?" The officer didn't answer. He didn't have to. Because outside, beyond the gates, the world was still ending. And survival was only the beginning. The end.